Good morning, class. Welcome to another lesson. We have been looking at the elements of literature. In our last lesson, we were looking at a setting, and we discussed that a setting is where the story, the fable, is taking place. Now we'll be looking at another element of literature, and it's called a plot. A plot, in simpler terms, can be described as a storyline of the story. A storyline of the story. The story itself is what we call a plot. In other words, a plot is a causal sequence of events, the why of the things that happen in the story, the events happening in the story is what we call or what constitutes a plot. The plot draws the reader into the characters' lives and helps the reader understand the choices that the characters make. So whatever you're writing about the characters in your stories, whatever the characters are doing in your stories is what constitutes a plot. A plot structure is the way in which the story elements are arranged, the way you arrange your story. To say you start, maybe for instance, you start a story about a village. You start the story in the village and you move the characters to the city. So that's what a plot structure is all about, the elements arranged in the story. However, writers vary structure depending on the needs of the story. For example, in a mystery, the author will withhold a plot, exposition, until a later story. So what goes into a plot? The narrative tradition calls for developing stories with particular pieces of elements. So a plot has different elements put in place. You can easily identify a plot by the sequence of events you're writing or the writer is writing. For instance, exposition. This is the information needed to understand the story. You have to have the information, what you are going to write about the character, what you're going to, if it's a true story, you have to know the information about that story. So that constitutes an exposition in a plot. And then there's a complication. This is the catalyst that begins the major conflict. So a plot has to have a conflict or what is happening in the story or some sort of a fight in the story. So a catalyst or a person, it can be a catalyst, a character or something that ignites the major conflict in the story. That constitutes what we call a complication in a plot. Do not be confused with the wording. A plot is basically, as I've already said, a storyline in the story. Whatever you're writing, whatever you're developing in a story is what constitutes a plot. And the plot also has to have a climax. This is the juice of the story, the juicy part of the story, where, for instance, in a movie, where you don't want to leave the movie or you don't want to stop the movie, you just want to watch the movie or you just want to read the book. The story is getting exciting. So that's the climax of the story. It is the turning point in the story that occurs when characters try to resolve the complication. So there's a conflict now, characters are trying to resolve the complication, are now involved in the conflict in the story. So that's what we call a climax. The exciting part of the story, where you don't want to leave the book, but you just want to continue reading to see what happens next. So that's what we call a climax of a plot. And then the last part of a plot is what we call the resolution. This is the ending part of the story. You have reached the climax, the conflict has happened in the story. Now you want to end the story. Now you want to explain or you want to write about how the story ends. So that's what we call a resolution in a story. In other words, it's a set of events that bring the story to a close. Set of events that bring the story to a close or to an ending. It's not always a straight line from the beginning to the end of a story. Sometimes there's a shifting of time, and this is the way we learn what happened and why. It keeps us interested in the story. But good stories always have all the plots, all the plot elements in them. It has to have exposition, complication, climax, resolution. That's a good story, and that's what a story should consist of. You can start with the climax of the story and then ending, bringing up now the events of how the story started. It depends as a writer how you choose to write your story. So whenever you're reading a story, you have been reading stories, go back through them as I've been telling you. That's why we started with reading the story, so you understand stories. Fables, we're looking at fables, we've looked at short stories, we've looked at poetry. So go then back to the short stories, to the fables, and then look at how the plot has been developed. Look at how the events have been developed in the story. Look at the climax where now you don't want to leave they identify such things in the stories. The way you don't want to leave the book, just want to continue reading. Look at the setting. We've looked at the setting and now we've looked at the plot. The next lesson will be looking at the theme, themes of the story. What is a theme in a story? Read on that and try to do some research on your own when you're in your homes. Thank you very much.